Hello and welcome back to the conclusion of the matter. I'm Ren Ferguson, and joined with me as always is Robbie Santiago. And again, Ryan is not here.
You did say as always.
Yeah.
Well, I will say after the first season, I was always here for the most part.
Yeah. The first, I don't remember how many episodes it was. Ryan and I did just us, but yeah.
That was like a string of things because we had last leaders convention right in the middle of that.
Yeah, and I think you had to go
COVID.
like a wedding or something too.
Yep.
Something like that.
It was like a string of events.
Yeah.
But I think there also was like probably a baseball game or two that got in the way somewhere along the line.
Yeah,
too.
maybe so.
But we're missing our third co-host.
Yeah, 2 weeks in a row. We're gonna have to renegotiate his contract.
Yeah, honestly, people are probably starting to wonder. No,
we didn't kick him out or anything.
No,
just things have come up. Life has happened, so understand that.
It's the time of year too.
Yes, it is.
Honestly, I mean, it's like 30 degrees today. I didn't really even want to get out.
I think the high was actually below 30. I think
I'm like not cut out for this weather. Even like remember last week. I don't even know if the listeners would have noticed, but I told you after the podcast that I sounded probably really nervous because I was so cold.
You're so cold.
So I've got like my hoodie on, and then I've got like 2 layers of shirts on underneath because I don't want to be like shivering again and make myself look like a fool.
I love this kind of weather. I've been hot natured for a long time, so
I like it if it snows. But if
it makes it worth it.
Yeah, if it's like 20 degrees and it's just like cold for no reason. I ain't a part of that.
I get that. Well, Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14, let us hear the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or evil. We're glad everybody is tuned in, and we're going to be continuing our study of Revelation. We're picking up in chapter 12. I guess I'll hand it over to Robbie, even though nobody's really leading this one this time, I don't guess.
Yeah, it is kind of funny. We'll just kind of play ping pong here, back and forth. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and get back into our study on Revelation. We left off right at the beginning of chapter 12, so that's where we're going to pick up this week. Or if you're just listening for the first time, that's where we're picking up for your first time. So,
and I would encourage to go back and start at the beginning of this series, or you're probably going to be kind of lost. Yeah.
Right. Some of the episodes, most of our episodes, you don't necessarily have to have
not really
context for. But this study might be one. And we were laughing. We planned for 4 episodes to cover the whole book, and we're already on 5 and we're like halfway through. But
it'll be all right.
Anyway, we're just going to have to adjust the schedule, maybe. So, anyway, Revelation chapter 12, verse 1 says, Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then, being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew a third of the stars. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there for 1,260 days. You guessed it. So right off the bat, it seems that it would be a parallel to Mary, and though it is a parallel, I don't think that that's specifically who it's talking about in context here, even though, the main thing is kind of the birth and pain of having a child, but also she didn't really, I don't know how that process officially played out. But as we know, Jesus had the miraculous birth there. But I personally don't think that it would be Mary, in the sense that I think that this is more symbolic of the coming of the church and kind of like that first century kind of time. Yeah. But anyway, go ahead.
I was just going to hit on a couple of things. First of all, at the very beginning of verse 1, and this is important for the entirety of the chapter, he says, a great sign appeared in heaven. This is not literal.
in
And we
heaven.
always need to remind ourselves when we read Revelation, because some people want to read it literally, it's a sign, it's a vision. He states it again in verse 3 too. But I agree. I don't think this is necessarily talking specifically about Mary. Though, like you mentioned, there are kind of some parallels to it. I do think, especially if you drop down to verse 17, it does seem like this concept of this woman, it kind of expands to include all of those that have kept God's commands.
Yep.
But to me, it seems like here, at least as of right now, and in this part of the passage, it seems to be talking about specifically the holy remnant of Israel, those that were faithful, that ultimately led to, kind of as you were talking about, the coming of the Messiah. I mean, going back to Abraham, Abraham and all of those promises given to Isaac and Jacob, and then to David, and so ultimately leading to, and I think we're already saying it. This child, I think, is a clear reference to Christ, because in verse 5, as you read, it's a male child and one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron.
Right.
But her child is caught up to God and to his throne. Again, I think a very, very clear reference to Christ. So this is, again, we might
Call it
split hairs on some of the details, but it's the coming of Christ.
right. Basically, like this system of Judaism,
Yeah.
if you will, especially like towards the end there. And again, it's not that I guess it couldn't possibly be Mary, but it just doesn't seem to really fit with the rest of
With the rest
chapter,
of the chapter
and also the
yeah.
rest of Revelation. But obviously, in some of the other religions, Mary's such a prominent figure
Right.
that belief is somewhat common as it relates to this chapter. And besides, I guess, again, kind of the mother and son relationship between Mary and Jesus, there's not really anything else to indicate it. So, okay. And then switching to the great fiery dragon with the 7 heads and 10 horns. It was ironic that it had 7 heads because the 7 churches of Asia, though it's not talking about that clearly based on the rest of the description we have. Best I could tell, those are just numbers just that kind of were really signifying authority and power.
Well, and one thing, too, that I saw with the heads would be intelligence. I mean, and I think we'll agree this is talking about the devil. He's certainly a very intelligent man, or not man, but being.
Right.
And the 10 horns, going back to what you were just talking about, authority, power, strength, things like that.
Right. And it's pretty obvious that it's talking about Satan here because, and we'll get into this later in the chapter, but just some of the other characteristics that are going to come play in terms of the actual, like, I guess you can call it battle that's going to be taking place. And the kind of fight that takes place really between, again, the symbolic system of Judaism in the Old Testament that's for the coming Messiah, but also with God's people in the New Testament. I did want to bring up in verse 6 again as well, though, that the woman had fled into the wilderness. I think that's kind of important context. Maybe this might be one of those things that we were talking about splitting hairs about, but it could also kind of be symbolic of that dead period that takes place kind of between. I wouldn't say that with any level of certainty, but the fact that it kind of retreats into that. But I did just kind of want to throw that out there. But more importantly, the ending there, the 1,260 days, was something that we talked about last week. And that's not really a specific period of time, but sometimes throughout the last few chapters of Revelation and then going forward, it'll bring up that 1,260 days. It'll bring up
42 months, right?
42 months, So it's all kind of like symbolic of like X amount of time that if we were to add it up, it'd be like a span of, I think, about 3.5 years. There was another way that it is also put. I can't remember what it was off the top of my head. I think it's later in this chapter or into chapter 13. But anyway, that's not really mentioning anything specific, just like a period that there's going to be some intense suffering going on, more or less.
And I would say, too, with verse 6, it points to God's providential care over his people. Because in verse 5, at the end of verse 5, it talks about how the child was caught up to God and his throne. To me, that seems to be an allusion to the ascension of Christ. And then after that, the woman flees into the wilderness. But either way, we see God takes care of this woman who, like I mentioned, I think represents represents those that are obedient to God.
Right.
Which again, keeping that in the context of who he's writing to and why he's writing to it, that would be a point of encouragement for them.
Right, absolutely. And you bringing up the timing of those things taking place is why I don't specifically think that it's talking about like the dead period between the testaments or anything like that. Though that is a belief that's out there.
Yeah.
So, okay. Anything else on that first section there,
No.
first 6 verses or so? Okay, well, we'll get into the middle 6 here, and it says in verse 7, and war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was there a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that the serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. We may pause there for just a minute to kind of reiterate the point that the dragon was talking about Satan and the devil, because it specifically mentions there, but also talking about the war that breaks out between in verse 7 there.
Well, we kind of actually, if I could just backtrack for a second.
Sure.
We kind of skipped over this with the first 6 verses, because this red dragon in verse 4, which is the devil, stood before the woman who was about to give birth so that when she bore her child, he might devour her. This whole chapter is depicting in different ways, in descriptive ways, the battle between God and the devil. And the devil has always been, from the very beginning, trying to thwart God's plan of bringing Christ. And that's what we're seeing described here. And I think, too, with verses 7 and following, we have a tendency to read that like it's historical, like he's describing some actual specific event that took place in heaven.
Between Michael and the angels versus Satan.
But I do think we have to remember it's a very symbolic book. And to me, it doesn't make sense why he would go from all of this symbolism in verses 1 through 6 to describing a very specific event, but more so generally, again, describing this battle that is taking place between good and evil and God and the devil, so to speak.
Right. I agree with you. And especially if you were to kind of break this down like verse 8, the fact that Satan did not prevail or the dragon did not prevail, and then being kicked out of heaven. I did want to kind of focus on that being kicked out of heaven, because even though it like takes place after most of the New Testament is probably written, this is probably not the point that, he was not associated with heaven. I think more important than the timing of when Satan was or was not kicked out of heaven. Well, but whenever he was kicked out of heaven, I mean, clearly, like the beginning,
something had to happen for this rebellion, as we like to call it. I just don't know if that's specifically what John is describing.
Yeah, that was kind of the point I was making, is it doesn't really make sense that this would be a literal thing, because, this spiritual warfare between, good and evil, between Satan and God's people, Satan and, Christians today.
Yeah.
That's been going on for a long time, and that was going on before the book of Revelation was even written, so it wouldn't be like a futuristic point that the devil is going to be kicked out of heaven. It already, he's not associated with heaven because it's antithetical to his nature and God's nature as a whole.
Yeah.
So
that's a good point.
Nobody, obviously, only being that knows when that happened would be, God really. Yeah. But this has clearly been going on since the beginning, hence the struggle with good and evil back to the garden. So this wasn't like happening at the time that Revelation was written. And I just wanted to kind of bring that up. And it was just kind of a sign of that it was specifically also continuing during the time of Judaism, during the Christian dispensation, and even to today, that this spiritual warfare is going to continue, but more importantly, that Satan was not going to be successful because Christ has defeated him once and for all.
And I think have you already read verses 10 and 11?
No, that's what I was kind of going to segue, unless you had something else for 7 through 9. No. So speaking to that, verse 10, then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ has come. For the accuser of our brethren who accused them before our God day and night has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. Specifically talking about in those middle verses that he was overcome by
Yeah.
the blood of the Lamb, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. I always hate quoting things off the fly after the other week, but that verse that's talking about that he's going to bruise their head, but he's gonna
Genesis 3:15.
exactly.
Yeah.
So this was something that was planned from the beginning after the garden, and then Satan is going to have this battle with Christians, with Jews, with God's people, with God himself. Spiritual warfare is going to continue, and then eventually Jesus is going to come and really just completely settle it and end that and give us that hope to defeat Satan and have hope of eternal life.
Yeah. And again, thinking about these people, what they were going through, what they were about to be going through. I mean, and he's kind of speaking here in verses 10 and 11 as if they've already conquered, which in a sense they have. They still have to go through the suffering. But if they remain faithful, they've already won. And that's kind of his whole point is remain faithful to God. You will overcome. You will be victorious. What is it? Is it 1 John 5 where he talks about this is the victory that overcomes the world, even our faith? I know it's in 1 John, but I can't remember. It might be chapter 4.
Well, even just like what we've talked about with the whole theme based on Revelation 2:10 and as we see throughout, remaining faithful for that crown of life. We did kind of skip over that part about the diadem earlier in the chapter 2, but that crown was obviously not that same word that's used.
Stephanos.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
the Stephanos is the victory crown, and Satan is never depicted as having the victory crown. He always loses.
Exactly.
What a
That's
loser.
the point that it's talking about here. Yeah. So that I just wanted to kind of glance at that real quick since we had forgot to earlier. All right. Well, anything else on that section?
No, I don't think so.
All right. Well, I guess we can just keep the train rolling. We're going to finish up the chapter here, verse 13 through 17. Now, when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place where she is nourished for a time and a half a time. I'm going to pause for
is that
just a
what
minute.
you were talking about
Yeah,
earlier?
when we were talking about the 1,260 days, 42 months, like it's all kind of depicted as that like 3.5 years. Because if you multiply like time by time and a half, then you get that 3.5 number there. So that was what I thought is in this chapter, but I couldn't remember the specific place. Okay. Anyway, continuing there at the end of 14, from the presence of the serpent. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Really, that verses 16 and 17 kind of prove that this probably isn't really Mary, because the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring. It also mentions in verse 1 about kind of persecuting the woman. So the devil didn't necessarily single out Mary specifically, but as we can see, there was persecution towards Judaism, figuratively, towards God's people, and also the offspring, talking about Christians.
Because that's what he defines what he's talking about there in verse 17, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. The ancient Jews, like prior to Christ, and I guess in a sense they held, if they were faithful, they held to the testimony of Christ in the sense that they were looking forward to the coming of Christ. But I think this is more clear. The more clear reference to those that were Christians, which that reminds me of Galatians chapter 3, I think it's verse 29, where he talks about how if we are Abraham's seed, then we are heirs according to the promise. Those that are faithful to Christ are the true descendants of Abraham, and that was one of Paul's points there. And so the rest of her offspring, referencing Christians there. And so when this dragon realizes, when Satan realizes that for one, he wasn't able to thwart God's plan in sending Christ, and Christ was able to conquer him, and nothing that he tried to do could prevent that. And he realized he wasn't going to be able to defeat God. He then turns his attention to those that were following God and says, I'm coming after you now,
Right.
which is what we see in all this persecution.
And to reiterate that point, you see kind of like what he's going to start doing in kind of beginning in verses 14 through 16 there, that the serpent's going to begin spewing water out of his mouth like a flood. And that, I think, is symbolic just of, bunch of blasphemy, nonsense, false prophecy.
Well,
he's going to start using that to his advantage to come in to basically take the church by flood.
To try to, at least,
and that, again, you see at the end of verse 15 that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood, cause God's people to be carried away by false prophecy. And we see that time and again throughout the New Testament. You bringing up 1 John, what happened in that book. Romans warns against it. I think that Paul warns about it in Galatians. I mean, you see it all throughout the New Testament about false prophets are going to come in. Now, the Revelation's written for the most part after a lot of those books are written, not all of them. But also going forward, it's not like that he's just going to, false prophecy is not just going to end whenever the Bible's completed. Even today, I mean, you've got plenty of people speaking a bunch of nonsense and things that are not true if we were to put them against God's word.
Yeah. And I think when we get into chapter 13, especially with the second beast that's described in chapter 13, we're really both of them, but he really kind of fleshes out more so, I think, this idea of this flood. I heard an interesting thing about the flood because he's spewing it out of his mouth. Well, if you look at John 8 and verse 44, Christ calls the devil the father of lies. And so to your point, all of the falsehood, all of the blasphemy, all of the false prophecy, he's going to be pouring out all of these things in order to try to sweep the people of God away, because he realizes, I can't beat God. Well, I'm going to try to get these people to turn away from him. And that's his ultimate goal. I think you mentioned on a podcast, I don't know if it was last week or a couple of weeks ago, there in Matthew 25, how hell is prepared for the devil and his angels, and you brought up that old kind of adage there that misery loves company. And that's kind of what we see here. I'm not going to win, so I'm going to take as many people down with me as I possibly can.
Or just like cause as much ruckus and chaos and pain and suffering as I possibly can. It's almost like I don't know why it reminds me of this. It probably shouldn't, but way back in the election of 1800, up until that point, you had George Washington, who kind of didn't really have a political party, but then the Federalist Party was the one that had power in pretty much all branches of government for the first decade or so within U.S. history. And then in 1800, the Federalists had passed some laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts, which restricted the freedom of speech and stuff, and so people voted against them in the next election. So Thomas Jefferson, the opposite party, Democratic Republicans, take office, and they win the executive branch, the presidency, and also they win pretty much the legislative branch as well with Congress, which leaves only the judicial branch. And so the Federalists are panicking because they're not going to be able to, hold power or anything. So at the very last moment, literally the day before Jefferson's elected in some of these cases, John Adams had appointed as many Federalist judges to different federal courts to make life miserable for the Democratic Republicans and specifically Jefferson, which Adams and Jefferson were decent friends before a lot of this and before the presidencies and everything. But this was really kind of the straw that broke the camel's back between them two's relationship literally until they died, which ironically was on July 4th, 1826, I think, but definitely on July 4th. But all that to say, as he's leaving office, he's doing everything he can to make Jefferson's life miserable for the next 4 years and to stack the courts against them. So anyway, I won't go down a further historical tangent, but it's the same thing that we see with Satan here, that he's going to be, he's lost. He's a loser. So he's going to drag everybody down with him. So ready to go to 13 or anything else on 12?
No, we're good. We can go on.
All right. So Chapter 13. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. There we go again.
Yep.
And on his horns 10 crowns, and on his head a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. So they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like this beast? Who is able to make war with him?" And I want to pause for a moment to bring up just a slight, I guess you can say, counter argument. I don't personally believe that this is the case, but one of the things that is kind of contingent on when you believe Revelation is written is to how you would interpret this opening section here, because a lot of people interpret it to be Rome for a number of reasons. Number one, because there are a lot of parallels between Daniel's prophecy and Daniel chapter 2, which the Roman Empire had not been officially kind of completed yet until around 495 AD. So a lot of people think it's Rome for that reason, because particularly verse 2 talks about a leopard, a bear, and a lion, which I think technically that part is mentioned in Daniel 7. So, but there's a lot of kind of symbolic things in terms of the language and in terms of just like how Rome is depicted there. But in verse 3, and I saw one of the heads as if it had been mortally or lethally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. So a lot of people think that, you know, this was the time when Rome briefly went through like a year-long civil war where you had about, I think, 4 Roman emperors that either were killed or committed suicide. And it ended up being, I think, Vespasian that took power to stabilize it. And then it was, you know, the kind of status quo Roman Empire going forward. So that's another reason that people bring this up. And also in verse 4, they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast. Rome wasn't necessarily known for being overly Christian. So
not at all.
And also a lot lot of their emperors were kind of the opposite of that, where they expected to be kind of worshipped as a god. In Nero's case even, and many of the other, well, not many, but some of the other emperors as well. So
well, honestly, that's kind of the interpretation that I take to this, because especially when you look at phrases, well, all of those things you just described, but when you think about, where is it? At the end of verse 2, the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority.
Right.
The dragon ruling over, in a sense, and giving this power to Rome. At least that's what it seems to me. But also the end of verse 4, where they ask the question, who is like the beast and who can fight against it? I don't know if anybody's ever really said that about Jerusalem and the Jews.
Yeah, I definitely don't think it's like the Jews or anything. I just didn't know with any level of certainty that you can certainly say
that's
this
the
is
thing.
Rome.
Like you mentioned, it depends on what date you take. And that's going to drastically alter how you view this. Again, to me, it seems to be a reference to Rome.
But anyway, I don't necessarily... This could be symbolic of just overall spiritual warfare continuing from the last chapter, but if it's not Rome, also on the flip side of that, again, contingent on the date, it doesn't really make sense to me that it would be Jerusalem. Because
they were not a world power, and definitely were not even anywhere close to a world power as this was being written.
Right. And I guess, well, there's a whole lot that we could counter argue if it's the belief that it's Jerusalem. But regardless, Rome, if it's not just like talking about spiritual warfare in a generic sense, then it would make the most sense that it would be Rome here. And again, like you said, just from Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 2 comparison, the language and that's used to depict Rome in Daniel versus here in Revelation, the timing also, the fact that it has like a mortal wound, but that it ends up healing from.
I read in some places making application to the death of Nero there, which led to the year of the 4 emperors, because he committed suicide, I think, in 68.
It was either 68, because 69 is when Vespasian took over.
It was after his suicide is when you had those 4 emperors, and so there was kind of a bit of chaos in the Roman Empire. But then they kind of figured everything out, and then the persecution that I think he's describing here kind of ramps back up, especially under Domitian,
Right.
from what I understand.
Yep, definitely. So let's continue unless you had
Yeah,
anything
no,
else
I'm
there.
good.
Verse 5, and he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. There we go
Yep.
again. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. So kind of what we've been talking about with Roman emperors and Rome
Yeah.
as a whole, not really being the most God-centered, God-focused people, and sometimes quite the opposite of that in Nero's. In Nero's case. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. Again, Nero and
Yeah.
Rome. And authority was given to him over every tribe, tongue, and nation, and who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life. Let me start with that verse over. And who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain for the foundation of the world. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. So, kind of, again, this is kind of a reiteration that if it's not like generic spiritual warfare between, Christians and either in Rome or just secular or worldly things, that it's very likely that this would be Rome because, again, wanting to make war against Christians to overcome them, wanting to be worshipped instead of worshiping God. So,
well, and again, this kind of picks up where chapter 12 leaves off, where the dragon becomes furious with the woman, and he goes to make war with the rest of her offspring. And chapter 13 is kind of describing his allies, the tools that he used, at least it seems to me, that he used to go about doing that. And it would appear that this first one is kind of generically the Roman Empire in using them to execute, because as you alluded to Nero, from what I understand, his persecution of the church was more heavily centered around Rome specifically, but then other emperors, starting with Domitian, it kind of expanded and went all throughout the Roman Empire. And so, again, but verse 8 is important, and I think it's going to kind of come back when we're looking at the second beast. Those who worship it, worship Rome, worship the emperor, which I think the second beast just kind of a foreshadowing is that false worship and things of that nature. But those who are written in the Lamb's Book of Life did not fall down and worship this beast.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? That was kind of the last thing that I was going to bring up from this as well. So, all right, let's go on to 11. We may have to speed up a little bit. We're at like 33 minutes.
Oh, really?
So we were laughing out. Will we get to 50 again this time? So it's looking like it, but we'll see. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. He performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive the mark on their right hand or on their forehead.
COVID shot.
Yeah. I was going to make a little comment about that too. Verse 17, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark of the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. So, yeah, there's a whole lot of mark of the beast.
We might only get through
tangents.
this chapter.
But anyway, what do you want to open us with here?
I mean, first of all, in verse 11, it talks about another beast. It had two horns, so again, emblematic of authority. Mm-hmm. But it's also a lamb, which was a symbol of sacrifice or a symbol of worship. which plays into what we see later being expounded. And he spoke like a dragon. So this again, he then in verse 12, he makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, which, going back to what we were just talking about, if that's a reference to Rome, this is kind of the emperor worship that began to be heavily promoted, as you mentioned, Nero being one, but also the emperors after him. And we know other societies and other cultures did that. The pharaohs did it. They claimed to be deity. But
Yeah,
again, it wouldn't make sense for this to be referencing the pharaohs because
they
weren't very prominent at this point in time.
No, they were like 2000 BC.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
they had already been taken over by like Alexander the Great. Ironically enough, Cleopatra would have been, not too long around this time or after this time a little bit, mostly after. But she was trying to kind of like revive the former Egyptian, empire, I guess, if you will. Didn't quite work out for her or Mark Antony. But anyway, all that to say that Egypt was pretty much a thing of the past at this point. So it would make sense to be prophesying about something like that.
But it's a very similar idea, I think, being represented here of the worship of the emperor and the empire.
Right. I don't even know that it specifically is just talking about worshiping the empire himself, other than just like using religious beliefs as a distraction as a whole, like non-Christian religious beliefs. Because you had a lot of different, polytheism and things going on in Rome too. They pretty much had the exact same religious gods and goddesses that the Greeks had too. They just came up with different names.
That's true.
They like put a different name on them. It's different. But all I had to say, whether you're talking about the polytheism and like the religious practices of Rome, or specifically of putting the emperor on top, I think it could be either. I don't think it really, in the grand scheme of things, makes a difference.
Probably doesn't matter. Yeah.
The point is that it's ultimately pointing them to really kind of be indirectly or directly worshiping Satan.
Yeah.
So
and that's what he kind of goes on to discuss, because he talks about the false signs in verse 13. But verse 14, he says, by these signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. So it's deceiving all of these people into this false worship. And he talks about those that dwell on the earth. Now, there is this contrast going back to verse 8, the contrast made between those that were following God and those that are dwelling on the earth. I think that's more indicative of those that were not serving God. And then verse 15, kind of another allusion to that. Anybody who didn't worship this beast or the image of the beast, they were to be slain, which that I think plays hand in hand with all of this persecution that we're seeing here. The Christians were not willing to compromise on the truth. They were not willing to forsake God. And so because of that, they were ultimately the object of a lot of this persecution. And then the mark of the beast. Unless you have something else you want to get into.
No, I was just kind of laughing about that part. A lot of people even think that that in the 666 is specifically talking about Nero due to his opposition specifically to Christians, but also I don't know of a practice of everybody having their foreheads marked for Emperor Nero, other than just like a sign of Rome's power and your loyalty to them. Rome expected people to be loyal, but that wasn't a thing that was really unique to Nero himself.
Well, the thing is the book of Revelation has talked about those that follow God being marked or being sealed, and it doesn't mean that there was literally an actual physical mark or seal placed on them, but that they were recognized as, we're followers of God. And I think in the very same sense, this mark or seal is they're being recognized as being dedicated to this false system of worship. And so they have this mark on them, so to speak. I hadn't heard this one, I don't think, but some people, whenever barcodes first started coming out, they thought that was the mark of the beast.
Yeah.
We can get very fanatical when we start getting into things like that.
Well, we did go to that escape room this weekend that had the barcodes on people, so that was interesting. But it wasn't like any kind of mark of the beast So, I mean, I even read some things that people had compared that to like John Calvin and Martin Luther, Hitler, obviously,
Yeah.
because it was Hitler.
Oh, the 666 being referencing Hitler.
But Calvin and Luther, because they were kind of like, the major opponents that started the Reformation to go against like the
Catholic Church. Yeah.
Even though it wasn't, the church that Christ established, a lot of people associate those.
Well, the
things.
thing is when you look at the 666, some people will take the Hebrew letters for Nero, and they'll say if you like add up, Hebrew letters for Nero, and they'll say if you add those up, which I don't know what they mean by that, it gets to 666, and it's like, okay, I feel like you can make 666 mean whatever you want it to mean if you're going to do something like that. But I mean, if you look at the verse, it talks about it's the number of a man, and his number is 666. The divine number, which we've talked about this before, is 7. So using 6, it's something that falls short of the divine. Mm-hmm. It's not real. It's fake. It's symbolic. And that goes back to this whole false system of worship and worshiping that first beast and all of these things. The people being deceived into this worship, persecuting those that were actually following God. That's not divine. That's human, and it falls woefully short of the divine.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
I don't think so. How long have we been going?
We're about 41.
We don't have time to. I don't think we have time to get into 14. Do you?
Not unless we really move it.
Yeah.
So
we could shelf it and save it. Hopefully Ryan will be back for next week, and we can pick up there.
That's true. We could have. I'm proud of us. We could have really gone down a lot of tangents with like the 666 and the mark of the beast, even, comparing them to like politicians and stuff. Right. You see, I mean, there's all kinds of. Didn't some people say Trump? Yeah. I mean, I've seen like Hillary, Trump, Biden. I mean.
But that's the thing. You could, if you're going to do that, you can make it apply to anything and anybody that you want to. But you have to keep it in its context.
Exactly. And that's kind of like the thing with the whole book of Revelation is, you can cherry pick, this one verse and take it out of context and make it say whatever you want.
Well, unfortunately, that's kind of what some people do, and they build a whole theology about it.
Well, like we've always said when talking about like Revelation as a whole, obviously, but also when you compare it to the Antichrist or 1,000-year reign, like all these other topics, use the simple passages to interpret the difficult ones. Yes. Don't use the difficult ones, especially with no context, to interpret the ones that are more simple. So, like you said, I mean, we kind of like get our wires crossed when we try to like take verses out of Revelation and then try to base the rest of our theology just on that. When number one, it's probably symbolic, and number two, probably also out of context.
Yes.
So, context.
Yes.
All right. Anything else you got to?
No, I don't think so.
Wrap up here. Well, as always, you can email us at theconclusionofthematter@yahoo.com. Obviously, we're going to extend the season a little bit longer so that we can wrap up with Revelation, so that we aren't leaving everything on a cliffhanger. But we will be continuing, of course, next season. Probably some kind of a delay. We aren't certain what that's going to be just yet. But once we figure that out, we'll let y'all know. But as we start planning our next season's episodes, we'd love for those to include topics and suggestions and questions that our listeners have. So email us or text us or talk to us in person, whatever you would like to do. Hopefully we'll have Ryan back in the saddle with us next week. It's always fun to have our third musketeer with us, but
third stooge.
Yeah, three stooges. That's probably more like it. But anyway, as for only Revelation 13 and 14, I guess you can consider this the conclusion of the matter.